should be now, by the way, is the time to wear your very safe safety glasses. Also, as you're back in the brewery, don't throw anything on or off or take anything with you. That will help us out. This is sweet. It's a little personal, personal crew.
Who normally carries that for you?
No, me. Here I am with it. Yeah.
Strong arms.
Yeah, that's right. All the kegs. All the kegs. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about, so do we have any homebrewers in the group today? One. Okay, so not that many. Well, you are going to be familiar with what I'm about to talk about, but we'll give the non-homebrewers. I personally am not a homebrewer. I like to drink beer. I'm happy to let others make it. So if anybody has any questions, don't go ahead and ask me, and we'll find out, and maybe our homebrewer can help us out. So there's 4 ingredients in beer. Does anybody have any idea what those might be? Water, hops, barley or grains. One more. Yeast. Look at that. Good job, crowd. A+. So water it's cool. That was the first thing that I heard, because that is one of the most important ingredients in brewing. A lot of times people forget about that, but it's really important. And that's one of the reasons why you see so many brewers moving to Asheville, is because we have excellent water here. We hardly have to filter for anything. We don't have really hard water with lots of minerals in it. We filter for 2 things here, chloramine and fluoride, and that's just what the city puts into the water in order to sterilize it for public consumption. So we take that back out, and we've got pretty much a blank slate to work with. The second ingredient that we'll be working with in the brewing process is the grains, or barley, as you said. I've got some examples here for y'all to take a look at. All these on the first top 2 rows there, those are all different kinds of barleys. I'm also going to refer to them as malts. I'm going to refer to them as malts in a noun sort of a way, but malting is a process. In order to malt a grain, you take it and apply heat and water. This germinates the grain, and then you quickly roast it like you would roast coffee. So this kind of activates the barley a little bit. And you can see that we've got this one got dropped, so there's all kinds of, they're all getting, interfered, but you can kind of get the idea of the different specialty grains that we have here. Like this might be a chocolate roast, this might be kind of like more of a caramel, maybe a honey over here. And for most beers, with the exception of some where they've added extra stuff in later, like our Thunderstruck Coffee Porter is an example of that, most beers that are mocha or chocolate, caramel, all that flavor, all those taste words are going to come from the barley itself. Most of the time, you're not going to have actual cocoa or actual coffee in your beer. All that comes from the roast. These on the top, we call these our workhorse grains. The reason we call them our workhorse grains is because we need, for any recipe, light or dark, we have to have at least 70% of our grains, 70% of our recipe has to come from these grains right here. And the reason for that is because when you roast a malt, as you roast it, it denatures the sugar in that grain. And we need the sugar in order to make alcohol. That's really important. So in order to get the alcohol content that we're looking for during the process, we need to have these higher sugar content grains. We use a lot of these kind of grains here. We have 3 silos out back where we keep them. We use about 3,500 pounds of grain every batch we brew. Yeah, which is a lot. That's a lot. Yeah. When all of our grain, once we're done with it, we send it to a farm, a local farm, and they use it for cow food. It's kind of like roughage in the cow's diet. They supplement with other more nutritional things. Pretty much all of our organic waste goes to either compost in that farm or to feed the cows. So that's another reducing waste and keeping things kind of in the area. So what happens is our workhorse grains come out of the silo and they go into that room back there where we have a grist mill. And that's basically just going to crack those grains. as those grains get cracked, they get put through a little tube up into the top. See that little triangle-shaped thing up there in the red scaffolding? That's called a grist case. And that whole thing is basically just like a giant scale. All that scaffolding is to weigh it and to find out when we've hit that 3,500 pound mark. Then we're setting the recipe. All the grains, light and dark for the recipe, go in there all together, all ground up. Once it gets to that point, then it's gonna go out the bottom there and into the kettle behind there. That is a mash and lauter tun, and that's where we're gonna add hot water. We're gonna keep our water at about 150 degrees for about an hour. The cool thing about barley is once you heat it to 150 degrees, the enzymes that are inherent in barley activate, and they start converting the starches in your grains into sugar. That's one of the reasons why like when you're talking about whiskey, for example, when you're talking about even wheat beer, you have to have some element of those enzymes in there. So, you either have to find them somewhere else or add them if you're not going to use barley, but a lot of recipes have barley in them because those enzymes are so important. So what we're doing there is we're basically making a barley tea, or a sweet liquor, it's sometimes called. Once we're done in that, once we got that 150 degrees for an hour, here comes the Gaelic. It's going to come around. This is our flagship beer. We've been making this since 1994, since we opened. It's about 50% of our sales come from Gaelic. So it's definitely our most popular beer by a lot. Back to the brewing process. After we make that barley tea, that sweet liquor, that moves along into this close kettle right here. That's the boil kettle. And that's where we're going to boil, as the name would suggest, we're going to boil that sweet liquor. There's two reasons that we do that. One, we want to sterilize our beer. At this point, it's still that sweet liquor. We want it to be completely sterile. I don't know if you guys have ever been to a winery or anything like that. You'll notice that this is much more stainless steel, everything. They're super meticulous about everything being really cleanly. It's really important in beer making that you introduce yeast when you want to and only what you want to introduce, versus a winery, which, kind of who knows what's going on. Don't get me wrong, I love wine. I love it. I love wineries too, but it's a much more organic, a little bit of a dice roll sometimes. All right, so we boil that to sterilize it. The other thing we do at this point is we're going to add our ingredients, our hops. So most of the hops we use, if you see down in the corner of this box here, are pelletized hops. They look kind of like rabbit food. They're not. One of our employees recently tasted one of those, and she said it took her like 2 hours to get the bitterness out of her mouth. They're super potent. The reason we use those pelletized hops is that we don't lose a whole lot when we go from a whole leaf hop to a pelletized hop. And it's a lot more, it's more efficient for storage, it's more efficient, and it's more accurate for our recipes to use the pelletized hops. And those go in during different stages during your boil. We do a 90-minute boil here. You technically, I think a minimum boil is like 45 minutes or 60 minutes maybe, but we do a 90-minute boil here. And when you're adding hops, the aromatic ingredients in hops are all going to be lost within 10 minutes of boiling, and you're going to be left with the bitterness. There are a lot of benefits to hops, by the way, in beer. You have all those aroma and flavor qualities. Anytime you're talking about a beer tasting like citrus or floral or like piney, those are all coming from the hops. We also are at this point, we're gonna balance out the sweetness in our beer with the bitterness from the hops. We've got a pretty sweet liquid going on right now. We wanna make sure that's balanced on your palate. The other thing about hops is they're a natural preservative, so that helps with all beer and its shelf life. So how much bitterness you get out of the hops sort of depends on what kind of hops they are, basically, and also when you add them in the boil. If you add them early on, all that's going to be left is any bitterness in the hops. If you add them later on, then you'll get the aroma qualities as well. This is an example of a dry whole leaf hop. The only beer that we make out of this is the St. Teresa's Pale Ale. That's the first one that you tried. And the reason we add that, actually, if you see that little, right behind that caution sign, that is called a hop back. And we pour a bunch of whole leaf hops in there, and we basically drizzle hot water straight from the boil kettle through there, and it infuses like a tea almost. So you're not getting any of the bitterness qualities from the hops out of that, but you're getting all that aroma. It's like a super, you can stick your nose in the St. Teresa's Pale Ale and just smell like grassy, awesome Cascade hops. So after we're done there, and we go through the hop back at St. Teresa's, then we're going to send that liquid through a whirlpool. The whirlpool is against the back wall over there behind the mash and lauter tun. And that basically is just going to send that beer through the first steps of clarification. Instead of putting it through a strainer, we just centrifuge out any of the particulates. We're removing pieces of hops, we're removing old pieces of grain. Because you don't want chunks of weirdness in your beer, really, even if that chunks is like part of the recipe. Some of our beers only go through that process. Two of our beers, the Razor Wit, which we are serving currently as a summer seasonal, that is a cloudy beer by style, so that's the only clarification that beer can go through. The other beer that we don't filter is the Black Mocha Stout, and that's just such a dark beer anyway that you can't even tell whether we filter it or not. So after that, we've got what we call a wort, W-A-R-T, once it has the hops in it, but there's still no alcohol in it. We need to get it over to the fermenter so we can let it sit with some yeast. But we need to cool it down first. We have a heat conversion that it goes through. Basically, the hot water goes in one side, we send cold water through the other side, and the heat gets converted from one to the other. That hot water goes back to the mash and lauter tun if we're brewing another set of beer, so we can completely save that energy, and it cools down the wort in the process, which is, I think, pretty cool. I wish I had one of those in my kitchen. All right, so once it's cooled down to a point where it's not going to kill our yeast, we're going to send it into the fermenters. These are huge fermenters. Just to give you an idea, we're doing 50 barrel batches here. And when I talk about barrels, you can pretty much multiply, when I say a barrel, you can multiply it by 2 and get it the amount of kegs it's going to be. So 50 barrels is 100 kegs. These fermenters, the ones across the back row are 100 barrel, and these ones in the front here are 200 barrels. So anytime you go to a brewery, you're going to have the brewing setup is going to be half at least of the fermenting capacity, just because it's more efficient for us to make 2 batches or make 4 batches, and then because the fermentation takes the longest. So here's where we're going to introduce our yeast, which is really like, the most exciting, really, time. And as far as like chemical reactions go, this is when the alcohol happens. There are only 2 different kinds of yeast in this world, and there's only 2 different kinds of beer. I mean, broad general categories, but there's either ales or there's lagers. And there's ale yeast and there's lager yeast. Since we're a Scottish brewery, pretty much predominantly do ales. We do one, our autumn seasonal is a lager, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the nice thing about doing only ales is ales take about 3 weeks to ferment, and lagers take about 3 months to ferment. So that lager that we're fermenting for fall is currently taking up one of the fermenters, and all the brewers are like, working around it. The other thing about ales and lagers, the difference is they ferment at different temperatures. So ale yeast likes to be a little bit warmer. It likes to be right about 60 degrees. And lager yeast likes to be a little bit cooler, about 55, 50 degrees, depending on the yeast. So these are double walled, these fermenters. There's propylene glycol in the middle of the 2 walls, which is basically a food grade antifreeze. And with that, we can control precisely the temperature inside of those fermenters. It does not matter what the temperature is out here. It's hot in the summer, it's cool in the winter, but those fermenters will stay. Not only will they stay entirely cool, but the brewers can be sitting in the brewing room and look and see different hot spots and send more propylene glycol directly to that spot, just to keep the whole thing exactly the same, which is also pretty cool. So at this point, once we're done with our fermenting, there's two processes that the yeast goes through. One is a aerobic phase, and one's an anaerobic phase. During the aerobic phase, the yeast goes through and eats all of the oxygen that's in that environment, and they use that oxygen to reproduce. Then once all the oxygen is gone, they go through and they eat all the sugars that are in that beer and convert it into alcohol, and CO2 is also a byproduct. If you ever see any of the buckets that we have hanging around, they might have like a tube and they might be like boiling looking. That's just us letting off that CO2 because these containers couldn't hold all of it. They would there would be too much pressure with that amount of beer. So with that, let's move on down here. We'll make. All right, so I'm going to continue to talk a little bit about the what's still going on with the beer. Once we get through that aerobic and that anaerobic phase, we drop the beer down to freezing. And here's where those cones at the bottom of your fermenters really come into play. Because here we've got the Cashmere IPA coming around as well. Let me just quick. The Cashmere IPA is a British style IPA. So just in case you feel like you don't like IPAs, this was my gateway IPA. It's a little bit fuller in body and a little bit lower in bitterness than a lot of those super hoppy American hophead style IPAs. So this was the first IPA that I ever liked, and now I like a lot of them. It's named after a region in India. The IPA, just for those who don't know, stands for India Pale Ale. And the reason for that was when the British were occupying India, they needed to ship beer over to India, and they found that it wasn't staying stable. It was tasting bad on the way there unless they added a bunch of hops to it. And since hops are a natural preservative, that helped that beer make the trip. So we're done with the fermenting. We drop the beer to freezing, which is about 28 degrees for beer. It's got that alcohol in it, so you need to get it a little bit closer, a little bit colder. And at that point, the yeast and the beer separates like oil and vinegar. We can pull that yeast straight off the bottom with those cones, and we can pull it straight off the black mocha stout, and we reuse it on the pale ale. Doesn't matter, doesn't contaminate, color contamination. We reuse our yeast about 10 times before we send it off to become compost. Just little generations of yeast before we start a new batch. At this point, we've got flat beer, but it is beer. We're going to take and we're going to filter most of the varieties. We filter through perlite. You might be familiar with perlite in gardening, but we use this super, super fine. It's almost like a powder to filter the beer, to force the beer through. And then it goes to these two tanks right here that don't have cones in the bottoms. Those are called bright tanks. And that's where we force carbonate the beer. Basically, the process is pretty simple. It's like if you've ever seen those stones those like foam stones that you stick underneath the gravel in a fish tank that aerate. It's just like that, only microscopic little bubbles, and we just force CO2 through that. It's called a carbonating stone. Force CO2 through that carbonating stone, and that forces, takes about 2 hours or so once it gets to those bright tanks to do a full batch of beer. And at that point, we're ready for bottling or kegging. This is our bottling line that we're standing in front of right now. I've heard it's about $1 million little entity. This is what one time I had to keep the bachelor party from turning on. Yeah, it happened. We are the only brewery in Asheville that does bottling. It's a big production to get into bottling. We do a lot of distribution though, so it's really important for us to do bottling. We distribute to 7 states. That would be Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, they say Georgia. Yep, Georgia. And I'm missing one, but it'll come to me. What? No, not Maryland. Yeah, Alabama. That's it. But you can call your state. Don't worry, we're working on it. We made about 22,000 barrels of beer last year, which just pushed us over the microbrew line into the regional craft brewery line. 20,000 is that cutoff. Just to give you an idea of how much that is in real time, we did one of those pony kegs, one of those little 6 barrels or torpedo kegs for every other person in Asheville last year. This year we're trying to get it up to about 30,000 barrels, so that not everybody will have to share. Yeah, I know. But bottling is a huge reason why we can distribute to such a. We do about 70% bottling and about 30% kegging. Kegging is actually a lot cheaper for us. We'll go down there and check that out in a minute. But so you can see the stacks of beer bottles down there. We use brown glass. That's to prevent the beer from being light struck. You definitely don't want light hitting your beer. That's more important than keeping like the temp. People ask me if you cool a beer down, take it on the refrigerator, and then it gets warm and then it cools back down again. That's not as bad as it sitting in the light. That's really the worst. That'll give you skunky beer is what that tastes like, and I'm sure we've all basically had an experience with skunky beer. Not my favorite. So actually the best bottles to use are cobalt blue, but the cobalt blue bottles are so expensive that it wouldn't translate to anybody buying the beer, basically.
Are there any beers that use cobalt blue right now?
We do make our Cold Mountain when we do the Bombers size bottles. We'll make ours in cobalt blue. I can't think of another beer. I know that there's a beer company out there that's marketing like a platinum beer, and those are not actually cobalt blue. I don't think they're trying to pass those off as cobalt blue, but just so you know, don't stick them in the hot weather or whatever, or the sun. So the bottles come to us sterilized. They move down this line right here and they get their labels first. That's a little bit unusual. We use bumper quality material labels so that you can stick them in a cooler and they're not going to fall off and stick to the side of the cooler. It also helps out our home brewers because you can peel those labels directly off the beer. You don't have to like scrub them, get the stuff up. They go, after they get their labels, they go down the line, they get a blast of hot water. That's just to make sure if they're sterile already, but that's just to make sure that nothing has gotten into them from here to there. And then they go down, they laser date the beer. You want to kind of try to shoot for drinking our beers within 4 months. Hopefully that shouldn't be a problem, but roughly they're not going to get bad after that, but they might start to oxidize. That's going to taste kind of like vanilla envelope or a little bit like sherry in an extreme case, which, not as tasty. So after that, then we're going to put a drop of liquid nitrogen in the bottles. The reason for that is that a lot of this process is centered around keeping oxygen out of your beer as we're bottling it. The liquid nitrogen turns into a gas immediately in the bottle and displaces all the oxygen in the bottle so that we can then fill it and have a much lower chance of putting oxygen into your beer. They go steaming from the liquid nitrogen, they go across the back there, and over in the corner, that's our filling station. It's basically like a big carousel. It swings the beer up onto a little filling sphere, which we'll see a big version of that maybe in a minute. Onto a little filling sphere, it starts to fill and then goes back around and down. And as it's exiting that filling station, we spray it with a laser fine point of hot water. The reason for that is it's such a little amount, we're not watering your beer down any. What we're doing is we're getting the beer to foam, which again displaces any oxygen that might be in it, and then we cap it as it's foaming just to make sure. And that's the real reason why you see headspace on your beer. We're not like the chimp company. We're not trying to leave space in there. That's for so that you don't have oxygen in your beer. And if we do, we don't underfill very many beers, but if we do, then that goes to it goes to feed the employees, which I always appreciate. So then once we have beer, then they get rinsed off because they were all foamy. They come down into this there's two little, it's got like two plastic sides. That's where they go into six-pack holders into boxes. This machine right here closes those boxes. This machine tapes them up, and then they swing down here and they're loaded onto pallets and put into the cooler. So all in all, it takes about 5 guys to run this. Their main job is just to prevent jams, to fix jams when they happen, and to offload beer. It really takes very little human interaction. It's pretty much all automated from the labels. So the boxes are being put together while this is all happening and being sent. So it's a pretty amazing machine. This is German made. We actually we try to get as much stuff American made as possible. Our fermenters, if we bought those fermenters from Europe, we could have gotten twice as many for the same amount of money, but we wanted it to be American made. The exception is this bottling line. Because it's such a high quality machine, we wanted this particular machine just to keep oxygen out of your beer. Let's step over to the kegging line really fast.
Good. Oldest, Tim.
Move your mic a little.
Yeah. This is only my second time using this.
Yeah, oh, really?
Yeah.
Not so bad.
Well, yeah. Better than
Don't
yelling.
start till you tell us.
Yeah. Our hops are from Oregon and Washington. They grow really well in the same sort of regions that like wine would grow. We'd love to get local hops, but right now you guys can step forward if you want. Right now, there's not enough local production for our hops to get them nearby. The tasting room actually made a small batch brew recently with local hops. We went out and picked them ourselves. Full labor from start to finish. But we don't have enough hops in the area to support. We use Cascade hops almost entirely. And let's see if I can think of anything else about our hops. I can't remember the company that we get them from, but if we go into the cooler, you can see the boxes of the other pelletized hops. So this is our kegging line. We got this from Bell's Brewing up in Michigan. When they outgrew it, they sold it to us, which is pretty cool. We have the oatmeal porter coming around as well. This is an awesome breakfast beer. Breakfast beer, indeed. It's not. Well, I'm sorry. It's not just for breakfast. It's very multifaceted. It's really multi-use beer here. This is actually our second most popular beer. Whenever we expand to a new area, this is the most popular beer, and then Gaelic takes over a couple months after that, and then stays the most popular, and stays the second most popular. No idea why. But we do put oats into the beer during the brewing process for these. That doesn't actually add any taste to the beer, it just adds that super smooth mouthfeel that you guys are experiencing right now. So back to our kegging line. Before we had this guy, we would fill kegs by hand. And in order to fill kegs, it's a pretty involved process. First you have to empty, if there's any old beer in there, you have to empty that out. Sometimes kegs come back to us with beer in them. I don't know why. Yeah, got me. But so you have to empty out that old beer. You then add an acid to the keg to clean it. You then add a caustic to balance out that acidity. Then you steam it out. You steam clean the inside, and then you add your beer. When you add beer, you're filling from the bottom up. I'm gonna try to see. Here's one. Here's a kegging sphere. This is the entire inner workings of your keg right here. This is your take-home moment. This is your very useful information and advice that you're getting. So when you get a keg for a party, or if you go to a friend's house and you see that they've gotten a keg, a lot of times you'll see this. I know I've done it before I knew better. Put the keg into like a trash can and then cover it with ice. Don't do that. Save the beer. All the beer is being drawn from the bottom of the keg up. So you want to ice the bottom of that keg, and that will get you cold beer. Otherwise, you're just melting ice on top of that thing. This is your take-home, useful, save the beer campaign. This is also, by the way, a large version of what we use for bottling. They just have little filling spheres, but they look just like this. When we were doing kegs by hand, we could do about 5 per hour. This machine can spit out 1 every 75 seconds. So significant improvement in speed. It's basically just 5 different stations where they do each one of those. They add the acid, the caustic. Those guys, I get asked this a lot. Those little, they look like chopped off tops of kegs. They're not. They're just adapters for the little pony kegs, so that the little torpedo kegs don't fall over when they're in the machine. So this machine also only takes 1 person to run, which is another reason why it's cheaper for us to ship kegs. If we get, it's definitely cheaper to ship kegs. It's cheaper to produce them. We own the kegs, so we just rent them out and we get them back. We don't have to invest in all the materials and stuff. But again, the bottling is our bread and butter. So, all right, y'all. I think we'll just step into the cooler really quick, and this is where you can, if you want to take a picture with 1,000 cases of beer, and cool off from this kind of hot.
Me in there.
I know, right? Me too. Just y'all, if you want.
Oh yeah. Does it really? They have a huge case of you.
This, for the gentleman who is asking about the hops, there's our hop union. Those are pelletized hops here, just keeping them in the cool environment. like you have to turn that down at some point. This guy, that's good here too. 34 degrees in here. Actually, the optimum temperature to store beer at is about like 60 degrees. But we keep it really cool in here because we don't know what the environment we're sending our beer into is going to be like. We don't know if they're going to have, you know, if they're going to go on a shelf at Ingalls and be at like 75 degrees. So we're trying to prevent any kind of aging happening in between then and now. No beer stays in this cooler for more than 30 days. With the exception of the barrel aged stuff right there. We've got a Woodford Reserve barrel, and I think the other one is a Biltmore wine barrel, but I'm not quite sure. And that's just some experimental brewer stuff, being crafty, doing something different. So usually I don't stay in here too terribly long because it's pretty cold. So we can mosey if you want. If y'all are feeling chilly. We do private label for Biltmore and for the Grove Park. I'll point those labels out. So this is just a mini last stop here. Just a mini little last stop. I was just going to point out, somebody asked me if we do any contract brewing for any other breweries. We do contract brewings for the Grove Park Inn and for the Biltmore. And the reason for that is just it's such an investment to invest in your own brewing equipment that they kind of rent us out. We don't turn the brewery over to them. We use our same brewers. We come up with a recipe in the pilot room, and they approve a recipe, whatever it is that they want, and then we make it for them. Usually there might be like a forklift behind me, so. So that's just cheaper for them. At some point, if they have a big enough audience, they'll invest in their own brewing stuff. So I guess that's about it. Does anybody have any questions I can answer? Otherwise, we'll go back. I think we got one more beer to drink.